This event happened when I was 57, almost 58 years old. I'd been flying airplanes for 42 years. I had 20,000 hours of flying time. And in all that time, I had never experienced in flight the actual failure of even a single engine. And I thought it would never happen to me. I was wrong. And I knew in those first seconds that this was going to be one of those events that divides one's life into before and after.
Before he became world famous for his grace under pressure, Chesley's Sully Sullenberger was just a Texas boy who loved airplanes.
We lived near an Air Force base, so I was always seeing jets fly over the house. I could tell you, what kind of airplane that one is, what kind of engine it has, how fast it would go, everything about it. I think I knew by the age of 5 I wanted to fly airplanes. My first flight lesson was at age 16, still in high school. My dad was a dentist, and he had a patient who knew a crop duster. And this particular man, L.T. Cook Jr., had been a civilian pilot training instructor before World War II. So drove out to his grass strip east of Sherman, Texas, saw his airplanes, met him, and he agreed to teach me to fly. He charged $6 an hour for the airplane, including the fuel, and $3 an hour for his time. My first solo flight was at 16. It was late on a Saturday afternoon, June 3rd, 1967. L.T. Cook had just mowed the grass on his grass strip. You could smell the cut grass smell. I made 3 circuits of the pattern, 3 takeoffs, 3 landings, and rolled to a stop back at his hangar, and he said, "That was good enough, I'll let you do it again." Very early in my flying career, a friend of LT's had tried to land at his strip, stalled, and crashed nose first into the ground. It was fatal to the pilot, the only occupant. I went out to the scene and with LT looked at the airplane. It was a red and white Piper Tri-Pacer. There was still blood spatter on the inside of the cockpit from where his head had hit the instrument panel. It was a very vivid, graphic reminder that at every point in every flight, you must fly the airplane and fly it well. You have to be the absolute master of every part of it.
The boy who loved airplanes became a man who yearned to find his future in the air.
I knew I wanted to fly for a living. I wasn't sure at the outset exactly how I was going to get where I wanted to go. But like my father and his generation, I felt an obligation to serve in the U.S. military. I chose to go to the Air Force Academy. It was a wonderful education, very intense, and I managed to fly 1,000 hours in airplanes and gliders in the 4 years I was a student there. And upon graduation, I was named the Outstanding Cadet in Airmanship for my class.
It was during his time in the Air Force that Sully learned firsthand how a pilot's decisions in the cockpit can make the difference between life and death.
I had about a dozen friends and colleagues who lost their lives in airplane accidents during the time that I was in the Air Force. Knowing people who died in aircraft accidents is a terrible weight to bear, but it's also a great motivator. It gives real meaning to the need to continually improve, to continually learn. It's that dedication, that discipline, that diligence, and that's what the best pilots have. At the end of my military service, it was obvious to me that the best flying I'd ever done was already behind me. If I stayed in the Air Force and wanted to be promoted, I was going to have to concern myself more with haircuts and shoe shines in the peacetime military than with flying. And so I chose to leave the military after my service obligation was complete and applied to become an airline pilot. It's quite a transition to go from being a military pilot, especially a military fighter pilot, to being an airline pilot, because we go from an endeavor that is inherently risky to one in which we avoid almost all risk. But being an airline pilot is very satisfying in its own way. At the end of a flight, to have taken several hundred people where they need to or want to go. You literally hold people's lives in your hand.
Sully met the love of his life appropriately enough at the local air traffic control center.
We both worked for the same airline. It was PSA, the one with the smile on the front.
And my airline and other airlines had sent a pilot and an airline marketing official to the regional air traffic control center.
I was a marketing person, and Sully was the airline pilot that was assigned to come that day. He had flown a red-eye the night before, and so he was pretty tired, unshaven, was red-eyed.
I asked her out, and she said yes. But it wasn't love at first sight. We had to grow into it.
I actually canceled our first date. I called his house and I told him I had a work-related thing and I canceled it. And then my roommate told me that I was never going to meet the man of my dreams if I stayed at home all the time, and I had to call him back and reschedule.
She quickly became the focus of my affections. I think it was the way that I felt when I was around her.
Sully was always just a stabilizing force in my life. I felt secure and loved, and he's my best friend.
In order to start the family they both dreamed of, Sully and Lori had to take the road less traveled.
Sully and I worked for a long time to have children, and ultimately we adopted both of our daughters.
We were blessed with the gift of girls. It's been a lot of fun seeing who they turned out to be and seeing the beautiful, strong, intelligent young men that they are.
Sully's devotion to his career meant having to accept certain sacrifices when it came to being a parent.
Being an airline pilot, I was gone about 2/3 of every month for 30 years. I missed a lot of the first things, the first words, the first steps. And of course, early in my career, when I wasn't very senior and didn't have a good schedule, Christmas was always the day when Daddy was home, regardless of the number on the calendar.
Though he treasured his time with Lori and the girls, Sully's real home was in the air, doing what he was born to do.
Sully wore the airplane. It was as if he put it on. It wasn't like he went and just flew this machine. It became a part of him.
It's a calling. It's not just a job.
I think to understand Sully, really to know Sully, you have to understand the depth of the character and professionalism of the man. And I know when I flew with Sully, every hour, at precisely 56 minutes past the hour, he would call up the latest weather. When you're flying to a destination that might be even 4 or 5 hours away. And we have to input the temperature, the air, the pressure, the wind speed at the airport into our flight management computers to get our approach speed. All that matters is the last one that you put in before landing. Before that, it doesn't matter. And yet, every hour, at 56 minutes past the hour, he would get the latest weather, he would load that computer, only to do it again an hour later. That kind of devotion to your job, going that extra mile, I think is what makes Sully truly great as an airline pilot.
For Sully Sullenberger, preparation is everything. He has a distinct dislike for surprises.
Sully is a man who likes to plan. He likes to have everything within the box.
When we fly in small airplanes privately, the two of us, he flew us down. Actually, we did a big hike one time, and I'm not fond of flying in smaller airplanes. And I didn't want to go. And I had said to him one day, oh my gosh, they're never going to find our bodies out here. And he said, oh no, I've had an emergency landing site in sight the entire trip. Everywhere we went, I knew where I could ditch the airplane to. So in the back of his head, he's always planning for that eventuality.
But on January 15th, 2009, the man who loved to plan faced a challenge he could not have prepared for.
It was shocking. The startle factor was huge.
He may have had to improvise, but I think he had planned for that day for 40 years.
Everything I'd done in my life contributed to the success of that flight.
He had investigated accidents and has memorized them for years, and so he has studied what went right and what went wrong.
Having studied in detail many previous accidents, it's obvious that above all else, fly the airplane and fly it well. If that isn't done, nothing you do after that will be sufficient.
Captain Sully Sullenberger, with almost no time, became a man for all time.
It took 208 seconds of calm courage in the skies over New York to turn Sully Sullenberger into the top news story on the planet.
I told Lori on the phone from the hotel that night in New York, I think our lives have changed forever. I just, at that point, had no idea exactly how or how much or for how long.
I can't even describe the hum of generators from trucks out in front and news media camped out on the porch, and I was trying to keep the girls going to school. They wanted to do their normal things.
Even as the world marveled at his achievement, for Sully, there was a price to be paid.
They snuck Sully home on a flight. When he got out of the car, I was not prepared for what I saw. He was distant. He had a glazed look in his eye. He certainly didn't come running to me. He had very dark circles under his eyes. He had lost 13 pounds in the 48 hours since the accident. So he was gaunt and distant, and I eventually went to him, and when I gave him a hug, he said, "I hope they know I did the best I could." It was hard the first couple of nights. He had nightmares, and it was hard for him to kind of settle his brain, and he was under a doctor's care because his heart rate and all of that was so elevated at the time.
My resting pulse is normally in the 50s. For 10 weeks, even under a doctor's care, it was 100. My blood pressure resting is normally 108 over 68. For 10 weeks, it was 160 over 100. I would try to read a newspaper or a magazine article and end up rereading the same sentence 5 times, never completely grasping it, finally giving up.
When Flight 1549 happened, I was 14 years old. I was in 8th grade. My dad was different the first few weeks in a sense of he was a lot more quiet, I would say. I think he had so much going on in his head, and for a 14-year-old, I don't think I necessarily appreciated that as much as or understood that, I should say, as much as I do now.
Your brain goes into a protection mode, and I think for a long time, the girls, myself, all of us had some post-traumatic stress. I know a year later, we went through a lot of migraine headaches, our hair started falling out, all of those kind of things.
For those involved in Flight 1549, the shock of being world famous overnight took some getting used to.
What we lost was our privacy. What we lost was our old lives. In fact, many of us on the crew initially were saying in those first few days, I just want my old life back.
Sully's a thoughtful, smart, quiet guy that's not seeking the limelight. I think that's hard to kind of step into that role.
It required us all to very quickly learn a new way of living an entirely new life. And it meant that we had to develop new skills and get better at old ones to be able to be public figures on the world stage.
It was definitely weird at first and trying to figure out what exactly this all meant for our family, and I don't think we ever expected to the extent that this story was going to resonate with everyone else.
We realized that this wasn't going to be your usual 15 minutes of fame and then fade from the news cycle, that this was different.
And once he kind of became a public figure, he couldn't go to the store to get milk. A 20-minute trip would turn into a 2-hour trip just because everyone was stopping him. And, when you're in such a great story, you don't want to brush those kinds of people off. It's, it's such a personal connection, especially when you're going in your hometown. People feel like they have an extra special connection to you.
We had gotten into a disagreement about something, I don't even remember what, and I was irritated with him, and so I had gone for a little walk, and I ended up down in the plaza down the way, and I was just wandering around, really, and wandered into this store, and this woman, I could tell right away that kind of look of recognition, and she said, "Oh, you're, Captain Sullenberger's wife, aren't you?" And I thought, okay, today I'm just going to be really authentic, and I said, "Well, yes, I am, but I'm a little irritated with him today." And she said, "Oh, honey, you should just forgive him because he's such an American hero."
For Sully, no adjustment was more difficult than learning to accept the H word.
When people called me a hero, I resisted it. Initially, I thought it wasn't appropriate. But with time, I certainly began to understand better people's need to feel a certain way about this event.
I think to really appreciate why the miracle on the Hudson was so important to so many people was to appreciate the time that this happened.
Because of when it happened during the 08-09 financial meltdown, when it seemed as if everything was going wrong and no one could do anything right. I think some people had begun to doubt human nature, wondering if it was really mostly about self-interest and greed.
The news was so bad and people were so afraid that they just needed that sense of optimism.
This was a bright spot, I think, something that people could grab a hold of and realize that, perhaps, we could climb out of this hole that we had dug ourselves into.
At a time when the world needed hope, these people made it their mission in life to see that good was done and lives were saved. I think that's why, years later, we're still aware of this flight, because of the way it has a continuing power to touch and inspire people.
Dear Captain Sullenberger, our son Connor was born 2 years to the day after that fateful flight. Connor wouldn't be here if you weren't there to save his mother that day.
As the plane came down, I was sure I would never see my children again.
I'll always think of you like the guy from It's a Wonderful Life. You'll never know how many lives you've touched.
Thank you for saving my daddy on the plane.
Grandma didn't make it to Charlotte to visit me, but she said not to be mad at you.
God bless you, Sully.
God bless you, Sully.
God bless you,
God
Sully.
bless you.
God bless you, Sully.
God bless you, Sully.
In the first weeks and months, we received, I think, 50,000 communications, letters, emails, faxes from people around the world.
Our house was covered every surface, every counter, every table for a year.
One of the first ones I remember was I received a $5 bill in the mail, and it had a little brief note in it. It said, "Congratulations, enjoy a beer on me, although a cheap domestic one."
Letters come to our house without our street address on them. They're simply, and from Europe, they're addressed Hero Pilot USA, and they come to our house.
One woman from Sacramento wrote us and said, "In the last 6 months, I'd lost my job, I'd lost my house, my father passed away to cancer, I had lost my hope. You, sir, gave it back."
For the Texas boy who dreamed of flying, the decision to hang up his wings was bittersweet.
I had said to him that I felt like he could do more for the profession from a safety standpoint out of the cockpit and not in the cockpit. He didn't have to do any more. He didn't need to fight anymore. He didn't need to try to help anymore. He couldn't change the whole world. It's not all on his shoulders.
It was time for me to leave the airline. Quite frankly, every time I would fly as a public figure, it was noticed, and it was kind of disruptive.
People heard his voice or his name and then, wanted to come up and say something or take a picture. And so, that's a delay.
And it also was time for me to take advantage of other opportunities.
I think we know that now he has a greater voice.
It's given me a bully pulpit to be an advocate for things I've cared about my whole life, for the safety of the traveling public, for the status of our beloved piloting profession. It's an obligation, I feel, that given this opportunity, we owed it to all our colleagues still working in the industry to speak for them. Not to do so would be a dereliction of duty.
From the 16-year-old in a Texas biplane, to the gifted Air Force fighter pilot, to the hero of the Miracle on the Hudson, Sully Sullenberger has excelled at whatever life threw his way. But his favorite role remains family man.
Someone early on asked me what my epitaph should be. And I said, husband, father, pilot.
After 30 years, he still looks at me and says that I'm the love of his life. And with all of the accolades and the stuff that has happened to him, none of that matters to him because it's me or the girls that matter. I think that tells you the measure of the man as well.